It's Friday, October 31st, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms, and happy Halloween. If you're watching this, you can see that I've got my Halloween sweater on today. This is about as wild as I get until a costume comes on. But that's not what we're talking about today, although we are talking about something a little bit scary. We're talking about the full realization of politics right now as revenge, as retribution. During his 2024-2023 campaign for president, Donald Trump promised his supporters that he would be their retribution, whatever that meant. And it's really clear in this moment, in the last 10 months, that he's trying to make good on that promise. Maybe for his voters, but really for himself, targeting political opponents, using the Department of Justice to go after them, using Congress and loyal members of Congress to smear his political opponents, trying to and actively sending military troops or federalized National Guard troops to cities run by Democrats in states sometimes run by Democrats or states with unfriendly governors, taking control of D.C., trying to remake the image of our nation's capital and erase the history of things like January 6th. It's why my guest today is Paul Starr. Paul is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He is a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. He is the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect magazine and the author of the brand new book, American Contradiction, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to Now. That book is available right now. We'll get into that in this conversation, but I think he's the best person to talk to about what it means for America to have our government run out of revenge, out of spite for the other party, for the other person involved. And I think it's a really interesting conversation, and not just for what it says about our current political moment and our politicians right now, but what it says about us, about who we are as Americans, that this is the kind of way we want our country to be run. And I think it asks some really big questions, and we get into some answers here, but not all of them, because some of these things, there just aren't great answers to. But I do think it's a fantastic conversation. And before we get to that, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new weekly newsletter out today. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. All right, let's get to my conversation with Paul Starr. You know, I've always got a cup of coffee next to me while I record these episodes. The studio is in the basement, and it's kind of cold, especially as we head into the fall and winter here, but a good cup of coffee is one of those small pleasures which I think we could all use right now. It's why today's episode is sponsored by Afuera Coffee. Afuera Coffee takes your coffee experience to the next level with their specialty, hand-selected beans sourced directly from sustainable, certified Rainforest Alliance farms in Central and South America. Rich, volcanic soils infuse each batch with unique, vibrant flavors. Afuera Coffee's commitment to excellence starts at the farm, where they work closely with local farmers practicing ethical and sustainable methods. Whether you prefer a bold espresso or a silky smooth light roast, their versatile range caters to all tastes. Now, I tend to go with a lighter roast in the morning and then switch to an espresso in the afternoon, but however you manage your own crippling caffeine addiction is, up to you. All Afuera materials, from coffee bags to mailers and postage, are either compostable or recyclable, and 5% of all sales go to conservation charities, which is obviously pretty cool. And right now, you can get 15% off your entire order with the code MIMS25. That's MIMS25 for their best discount offer right now, and you can only get it from Make It Make Sense. The podcast does get a cut of some of that, but honestly, it'll just go right back into ordering more coffee, so you'll be helping me stay awake to make even more things make sense. Again, that is MIMS25 at checkout at afueracoffee.com. That's AFUERA.com. Taste the excellence with every sip with Afuera Coffee. All right, let's get on with the show. Paul, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
I'm so glad to be with you, Grant.
So let's start with the idea of revenge politics. What do you mean by that, outside of the idea that Trump right now in this shutdown even is saying he wants to make politics of America as painful as possible for Democrats. Is it just that simple?
So Trump's personal interest in revenge, I don't think is at all mysterious. He has always been clear. If you, as he said in one famous tweet, if you come after me, I'll go after you. And that is just, it's probably the way he has always done business, personal and political. It's a kind of mafioso style. And Americans knew full well, especially in 2024, when he was so open about his intention to get revenge on his personal enemies and his political enemies. And indeed, when he said, I am your retribution to a conservative audience, he was promising them he'd get their retribution. What was that about? That was retribution for all the changes that the progressive currents in liberalism have brought about, I think, over really the last 3/4 of a century. And it's an amazing thing that enough Americans would approve or tolerate, accept retribution as legitimate. But that is where we are.
It's interesting too, because I remember him writing in one of his books in 2000, whichever version of, I think, Art of the Deal it was that came out then, has this little line in there where he says that the Trumps get even always. That's his entire approach to everything he does. And you can see that he's so transactional in that way that it's hard not to see that revenge would just be part of how he lives his life. But he also loved to tell that story in the campaign trail too about the snake, that like, I was a snake before you let me in, kind of a thing, which I agree with you that this idea that so many Americans, 49.9% of Americans or whatever it was in the end, said, yeah, that's the thing we want. But before we dive into what their reasonings are, I think what you talk about is this really interesting maybe separation or parallel tracks of revenge politics in American history. You've got sort of the early, I don't know, let's say Goldwater, Reagan, Bush 1 version of revenge politics, and then that changes in the 1990s. So can you walk me through those two things?
Well, I don't think that first phase that you talked about was ever really openly talking about revenge. I certainly don't think that was the spirit of Ronald Reagan, which was a very positive spirit on the whole, and optimistic about America. So let me just step back and talk a little bit about the framework of this book that I've written, American Contradiction.
Yeah.
And the first half is about what I call the American revolutions of the 20th century. And those were, I argue, set off by the Black freedom struggle that became a model for not only for other ethnic groups, for Hispanics, Native Americans, later Asian Americans, but also for the feminist movement, also for what was originally the gay rights movement. The Black freedom struggle set a model in the sense, first of all, of the many of the tactics that were used, but also the legal claims through the courts about civil rights, anti-discrimination law, and cultural ideals of asserting pride, dignity for just those groups who had historically been denied equal respect in America, not just equal rights, but equal respect in America. And that this was a challenge to all the old hierarchies that existed in American life: whites over blacks, men over women, straight over queer, the whole pattern that had been taken for granted, even was taken for granted in earlier years of progressive reform, the New Deal and so forth. The New Deal did not really challenge any of that. And the changes that grew out of the Black struggle were challenging these old, taken for granted hierarchies that many people believe are just natural. That's the way things are. and it was very upsetting to many people. And it's no surprise that each one of those drew a backlash. And
Yeah.
that was true right from the start. There was a backlash. But the Black struggle created a lot of moral capital. It really changed, I think, the way many people thought about values, about the basis of American public life. So there was a backlash, and there was what I call half a counter-revolution from Nixon through Reagan and Bush. There were real setbacks to all of these changes. There was particularly a setback to the earlier change brought about through unions, and the biggest change in terms of equality in the United States in the late 20th century was an increase in economic inequality. But the movements, these movements that had grown on behalf of civil rights and feminism and so forth, they continued. They weren't put out of business. So that's in the sense it was only half a counter-revolution. And I say half a counter-revolution because we now can see what the full counter-revolution looks like. And the second half of the book is about how we get to Trumpism, which I call total revenge against all these earlier movements. And and a lot of that process, I suggest, happened really without full awareness about the significance of steps that the United States was taking, that often Democratic administrations were taking. So the second half of the book is called Sleepwalking into Revenge. So I think there was a lot of sleepwalking, for example, in regard to the free trade agreements, just not registering what the consequences would be for millions of working people from the loss of manufacturing jobs. The economists would say, well, on the whole, you balance everything out and the economy will be better, will be, move from manufacturing to services, and there'll be higher productivity and so forth. And I'm not saying those things were untrue, but what they neglected is that there were going to be millions of people on the losing end of those changes.
Right. That doesn't help the guy at the plant. I'm in Detroit, so it doesn't help the guy at the plant, 10 miles away from me if his job goes away. But on the whole, a management sector job gets replaced, or two of them get replaced. That's not helpful to him, right? Yeah.
There was also very little understanding of what the consequences would be of immigration. Now, I think, on the whole, immigration has strengthened America culturally, economically, in many ways. I think immigrants have contributed enormously to American society. But again, there are many people who felt themselves on the losing end of these changes. And I go back in the book to the original hearings in 1965 about the big change in the immigration laws. So back in the 1920s, the United States had adopted immigration restrictions that particularly restricted Southern and Eastern European immigrants, mostly Catholics and Jews. And they were the groups that were pressing for a change in the immigration laws. And at the first hearing, Senator Ted Kennedy said, the ethnic mix of this country will not be changed, will not be upset. And that may seem amazing. How did they not realize that this legislation wouldn't change the pattern of immigration? Well, the law had a system of family preferences. And so who were the families in the U.S.? It was their kin, it was their relatives who were going to get preference in immigration. There were also economic preferences for certain skilled categories. And they just didn't understand what the consequences would be over the years, because it wasn't anymore those Europeans who were so interested in coming to the United States. So we really didn't, I think, um, um, in many different ways. I could go on about other changes in policy that were made where there was just very little understanding of what the impact would be. And this just happened to be in an era of technological and economic transformation where there were bound to be many people on the losing end when the companies they worked for were going to lose out to new startups. There'd be, there are whole new areas of the economy that developed, but all areas that suffered. And so it's kind of like a tragic historical process. America was, I think, through the civil rights legislation and other things, trying to remedy historical injustices. And at the very same time, there were all these people who had benefited from earlier changes, benefited from the New Deal, and now they were losing their footing in the economy. And that coincidence, it's partly not just a coincidence because I mentioned the free trade legislation and so forth, that accelerated, intensified their problems. Yeah. So that's, I think, what created part of the basis for a politics of revenge.
I think the interesting thing here too is that when you talk about that sort of, half counter revolution between Nixon and Reagan and Bush 1 to what we see now, there is a sense of there's that pushback, there's backlash to a cultural degree, but they stop short of really undoing a lot of the liberal progressive things that had happened. I mean, by and large, you can argue differently, obviously, but Nixon, for example, starts the EPA, or certain programs that Reagan pushed now would be considered wildly liberal today, and it strikes me as confusing, or it's hard to circle the square of how do we move from that in the conservative movement to a politics now that really just seems like light it on fire and watch it burn.
Yes, it's an enormous shift. It's been an enormous shift within the Republican Party. So that Republican Party, the Republican Party that existed at the time of Nixon and even under Reagan, that Republican Party still had elements of a progressive tradition within the Republican Party. I think many people today may not realize how significant that was. So let me just give the leading example. The Supreme Court Chief Justice during the era of the most liberal court in the United States history, Earl Warren. And who was Earl Warren? He was the 3 times elected Republican governor of California. He had been the Republican candidate for vice president in 1948. He might well have been the candidate in 1952 had it not been for Dwight Eisenhower, commander of U.S. forces during World War II, entering the
a popular guy. Yeah, he was pretty popular. Yeah.
But Warren was a major national figure in the Republican Party, and he's the one who led the Supreme Court to the 9-0 decision in Brown v. Board of Education to desegregate Southern schools. And he led a whole series of other decisions, wrote a whole series of decisions himself about interracial marriage, for example, all of those pioneering things that happened during the 60s that the Supreme Court was so centrally involved in. And Republicans continue. This is kind of amazing, I think. Republicans gained a majority, Republican appointees gained a majority of Supreme Court justices in January of 1972. That was as a result of Nixon's 4 appointments. And there's been a majority of Republicans on the Supreme Court ever since. But those Republicans initially who were appointed to the court, many of them came out of a more moderate and in some respects, even progressive background. And that's why there wasn't a full-scale reversal, because the Supreme Court in those days wouldn't have allowed it. So this is what I'm trying to emphasize, is that the huge change we've seen has mostly been a change within the Republican Party. We've had two transformations. So from Nixon to Reagan, there was a big change. Reagan was a much more consistent conservative than Nixon had been. But then from Reagan to Trump, that's a huge leap.
Yeah.
And I mean, we just saw how petulant Trump could be when the Canadians reminded people that Ronald Reagan had been against tariffs.
Right. Because he was I have talked about that on social media, that ad, and I played some of it. And when you read the overall speech from Reagan that Trump is talking about, that he's angry about there, Reagan is against tariffs. He's putting tariffs on Japan in that, or sort of in that way, because of wanting to have Japan come to the table for manufacturing. Like I said, I explained this other places, but it's an anti-tariff speech. That nothing was out of context here. Not really anyway. It's strange to me to see that this is the kind of politics that evolves out of all those things that you just talked about, because it does, like I said, it feels like they're setting the house on fire and watching it burn while we're all still inside it with them. They're there too. And I think I and a lot of folks have trouble understanding the thinking behind that kind of revenge. And maybe that's a psychological question and not a political one. I don't know.
Yeah. So here's what I suggest. I think the changes, especially since the 1990s, the changes demographically and culturally in the country, have landed very differently on the left and the right. So on the left, there's been an expectation that the future was going their way. And it was going their way because, well, the population of people of color was growing. It was going their way because, based on a lot of trends, there was increasing support for LGBTQ people. There was increasing support for a lot of causes that conservatives reject. Now, on the conservative side, it's just the opposite. They saw the demographic changes and the cultural changes as really a threat of impending catastrophe.
Yeah.
And I think that that fear of what was happening among the people of the United States and the culture of the United States, that fear created a willingness to embrace this politics of revenge.
Do you think that is, at this point, just purely racial? We're talking about great replacement theory kind of talk coming out of the mouths of people on places like Fox News or OAN, or even, the deputy chief of staff at the White House in Stephen Miller, or senators. It used to be, they called it economically anxious in 2016, or in 2024, it was people who voted because they wanted to lower prices. But it really does feel at this point that this racial makeup panic that is founded in broad white supremacy is the driving force behind what we understand as this revenge.
So I don't want to reduce it all to race. I do think race is a considerable part of it. And by the way, let me just say, another argument that I make in this book is that this is largely a mistaken perception about the future, that people have misread the demographic data. There is no prospect in this century that whites will become a minority. And I've written a lot about this in more academic articles that have challenged the way other people have seen the data. But let me just say, it's partly because a lot of the projections assume that everyone of any, for example, Latin American descent will be part of the non-white racialized minority. And actually, in the census, about half of Hispanics have self-identified as white, and they're not deluded about their ability to assimilate. Um, um, Hispanic marriages with non-Hispanic whites are a very high proportion of Hispanic marriages. And what we actually see over the generations is the Hispanic population is tending mostly to merge with the white population. So this idea that the white population is going to become a minority, well, you know, if you think of the white population as being those exclusively who have no Latin American heritage, and by the way, let me just mention here too, Asian white marriage, very common, and the children generally think of themselves as white and are treated as white. And so we're not by the way, this has happened a lot before American history. When Italians came, they were often treated as being non-white. This is, and yet, who thinks that way today, right? So it's very likely that the boundaries are going to shift over time, and that I think it's a safe prediction that 50 years from now, 75 years from now, there still is a white majority in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, for listeners, this is the exact thing that on a number of occasions I've had Mike Madrid on the show, and we've talked a lot about this, this idea that this is a Latino century in the way that you were just describing here, Paul. So I think that's really important to also think about. The idea, too, that as most of our political panics or moral panics are, it's sort of not real. It's made up in large part or based on faulty ideas, but it still drives this great replacement idea. It still drives people to this thing. And I do think that a lot of people want to hide behind the idea that they voted for a revenge president to get revenge on high prices, even though what they're hearing every day from people that they watch or listen to is this other thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So one reason I don't think it's all race is that I take very seriously the aspect of gender, the dimension of gender. And we've really been through an extraordinary transformation over these last decades, with the not just the growing participation. I'm going to use some sociological language, or
hit me,
like participation of women in the labor force. That's the way it's often described. But really, in many respects, women are doing better. Younger women are doing better than young men in regard to education and jobs in many of the areas of the economy related to services and so forth. And there's a reason that there's a lot of economic anxiety among men, among young men, because many of them have lost the kind of guaranteed job security that, let's say, their parents or grandparents once had. And so, there's a lot of real tension there. And I think you can also see that in the polling data, where women have been much more supportive of change than men have.
Yeah. I mean, you even saw in the last election, the presidential election, I mean, women broke for Kamala Harris, I think nearly 2-1 compared to men their same age. There's a widening political gap between young men and young women between the ages of 18 and 29, even though the president, as of this week, is cratering in support among young people. But I don't think that's pulling a lot of those young men back, right? That's not, they're just losing faith in the entire thing. They're not going somewhere else. Yeah. Can I switch to the Democratic side of this thing now? I want to talk about this idea of Democrats over the past few decades, maybe half century even, sleepwalking their way into allowing an opposition party to them that is a party built around revenge. Because it's a fascinating idea to me. Explain to me this notion.
Yeah. So what I argue is particularly since the rise of Newt Gingrich, um, who became Speaker of the House, and as a result of the 1994 congressional elections, but who had already assumed a very important role among Republicans, and he really represented a break from an older Republican leadership that had been more interested in cooperating and compromising, that treated Democrats with some respect and civility. And Gingrich came in and adopted a much more hostile,
Hmm.
confrontational posture, and argued he had these lessons for other Republicans about how to talk about Democrats, and they should be described, he said, as sick, as traitors. He had a whole glossary of words that he recommended to other Republicans for describing Democrats. This was a tremendous break in how politics was done in this country. It was a different model, um, and um, and I think there's a direct line from Gingrich to Trump.
Hmm.
Where there's just no acceptance of the legitimacy of the other side and the need for compromise.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can even hear it in the way that Republicans are talking now or have been in the past decade at this point, since Trump really, makes his political leadership thing known, is that they don't think that Democrats deserve to have power again. There is no version of an American government in which they think Democrats should be answered to or should hold any kind of power. And it's interesting to me that in this moment, in 2025, so many people kind of look down their noses at the idea of political decorum. Um, and it's funny that at one point in time that was so highly regarded, but also it's still kind of regarded among Democratic elites and Democratic voters. Which is that the sort of sleepwalking you mean?
Yeah. So on the one hand, the old Republican leadership, people like John McCain,
Sure.
um, uh, who had those um, respectful, often cooperative relations with Democrats. That leadership is completely gone. Actually, one very striking thing, if you looked at the 2024 Republican and Democratic conventions, at the Republican conventions, the older generation of Republican leadership, the Bushes,
Mm-hmm.
the Canes, and so forth, they were nowhere to be seen. They were not honored in any way. Trumpism was a complete break. And Trump himself had nothing but scorn for those previous leaders. Nothing similar has happened on the Democratic side. At the 2024 convention, they honored Bill and Hillary Clinton, the
Mm-hmm.
Obamas, Jimmy Carter, and so forth. There's a greater sense of continuity. And there was Democrats by and large have tried to appeal to Americans on the basis of what used to be widely accepted norms and standards of how you act in public life.
Mm-hmm.
And Michelle Obama had that famous line, "When they go low, we go high." And she might have been speaking, actually, I think, for a lot of Democratic leaders who thought that was the way to go, that Americans would recognize
Mm-hmm.
that going high was the right thing to do, good for the country. I think that's very much how people like Obama and Joe Biden
Yeah.
conducted themselves.
Yeah.
But they were playing now with a different kind of team. This was no longer the old game. And Democrats have had, I think, a very difficult time adjusting to a much rougher, bare knuckled kind of politics.
Is it sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy for Democrats that because they're the people who constantly appeal to the, better angels of Americans' natures, that they then have to be the people, that the rest of us hold them still to these norms when, because Republicans don't, the American public writ large also doesn't. And we let certain things slide for Republicans that we would never allow Democrats to do.
Yes. Well, I think those Democratic leaders who don't observe the norms will get punished by Democratic voters who want them to uphold a better standard. But I think we're seeing a very interesting thing play out now on the issue of gerrymandering.
Yeah.
So, and this is the question of do you play tit for tat? Do you do to the other side what they're doing to you? And what's the limit there? So, over the last several decades, many of the blue states created independent districting commissions to limit gerrymandering. They tied their own hands. New York, California, many other blue states. That's not what the red states did. They didn't create, and there are a few of them that have them, mostly small states like I think Wyoming or Idaho. But the big Republican states, Texas or Florida, they never did that. They left themselves free to gerrymander. And so right now, not only is Texas gerrymandering, but so are a number of other Republican states. And Democrats are divided about how to respond to this. I mean, you see Gavin Newsom saying, if you're going to do this, Texas, we're going to do it in California.
Right.
But it's, and we'll see what happens with the referendum in California, whether Newsom will be able to do this or not, because they've actually got to change a system that had been created earlier that tied their hands. They've got to untie their hands. And in some states like New York, they're not going to be able to do it before the 2026 election. Even though they're, Kathy Hochul, the governor, does want to do it, but I don't think she can accomplish that in a quick enough time, because is it a constitutional provision, New York State Constitution?
It is. I think right now, the Elias Law Group is trying to sue to change the map as well. That happened this week. Virginia is going to redistrict. That they're a semi-neutral, semi-independent legislature-ish led commission, but they're run by Democrats right now. But like you said, it's probably just not going to happen in enough time to get ahead of what's happening in places like Missouri and Texas and Florida.
Yeah. So, it would be the right thing to have those independent districting commissions.
Sure.
If every state had them, or if the Supreme Court had set rules limiting partisan gerrymandering. But you can't just tie your own hands if the other side isn't going to observe the same rules. You just can't do that. And unfortunately, we're all being dragged down to the lowest level. And I think it's really what's happening in many other respects. There's a kind of degrading of politics that is happening here, because if one side uses rough tactics,
right,
where are you going to draw the line?
Right, you're rolling around with pigs, you're going to get muddy, and right now we're all muddy. And it seems like in doing this, maybe if Democrats go full, I don't know, what do we want to call it, full revenge on their end of this, even further than what people like Gavin Newsom have been doing, or what J.B. Pritzker has been out talking about doing, or even someone like Zohran Mamdani in New York, while a generally positive New York mayoral campaign, is doing a lot of tactics that Democrats don't care for in a lot of ways. And is it that we're just going to live in that space forever? Or is it that this is some sort of political nuclear arms race to the bottom, that someone is going to have to come along and be a unifying president again? It seems like we're a long way off from that. How do we get out of this, I don't know, death spiral that we're in?
So I think you have to play tit for tat to a certain extent. But there have to be limits. So let me give an example. Trump is using the Justice Department now to pursue his enemies: James Comey, Letitia James, John Bolton. I don't believe that if Democrats hold power, for example, in the states, I don't believe they should do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a depth to which Democrats should not sink. It is extremely important to maintain rule of law. And rule of law cannot be the rule of revenge. That is just using the power of the state to pursue personal revenge has got to be off limits. So I believe, what Trump is doing with the Justice Department ought to be fought in the courts and protested in every possible way. But I don't think that it's a good idea for Democratic attorneys general or others to start trying to match what Trump is doing.
Yeah. My last thing here too, and this is maybe a little more esoteric, is the way out of some of this as well on us, the American public, the American voter, to just simply not stand for some of the things that we are seeing out of the Trump administration right now, whether it is the degradation of the rule of law, whether it is, some of the real norm breaking at its rootest or at its worst, and looking at ourselves a little, national introspection about who we are and where we've gone and who we've become. Is that a thing that's going to have to happen?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope that people will come to recognize that this is dangerous, that we can't have a country that is at war with itself. We can't have this kind of perpetual ugliness without dragging down the United States as a whole. This is no way to make America great again. It just doesn't work. It won't work. It will make us all weaker and poorer in the long run. To me, that seems clear, but I think at this point, it's a very difficult message to get across.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, with Grant, it's been a pleasure.
I want to thank Paul for coming on the show again here. If you want a link to his new book, American Contradiction, Revolution, and Revenge from the 1950s to now, it'll be in the show notes along with links to his public appearances coming up. He's in New York, he's in Boston, he's at Princeton, he's in D.C., and he's in L.A. coming up. So if you live in or around any of those areas and you thought this conversation was interesting, go check him out live. It'll be really worth your time. I really think so. But other than that, that is it for this episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. Like, subscribe, leave a comment below, and hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack so you get access to those free weekly newsletters as well if you want to become a paid subscriber to weekly original reporting and analysis on the news of the week. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. Have a safe and happy Halloween, and I will talk to you next week.